Okay, today I want to talk about dienes and various forms of delocalization. So, within the category of diene, or having two CC pi bonds, there are three types. And these include, first, conjugated dienes, where you have continuous sp2 centers, at least 4 of which in a row. Isolated dienes, where the pi systems do not participate. And finally, cumulated dienes. Cumulated dienes, we generally indicate the central sp carbon with this dot here to show that it has linear geometry. And one substituent at either left or right end of the diene will be coming out of the board, and one will be planar in the board. We'll explain that phenomenon with the various pi systems. So you should think first about how the p orbitals either interact or do not interact. For conjugated dienes, there are 4 consecutive parallel p orbitals. And it is essential that they be parallel such that they are in resonance and thus conjugated.